lovelies, welcome back to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. How you doing? Nice to have you back here. If you are stumbling across this channel and haven't seen any of my stuff before, well, I release my content on a Wednesday and Sunday and it's always crime related. Usually murder, I'm not gonna lie. Also, to all of you returning, thank you for all your support. Thanks to Patreon supporters, you're amazing. I really appreciate it. Thank you for always thinking that my content is good enough to actually support. It kind of blows my mind. As ever, little bit of a disclaimer, if you can't afford to do it, don't do it. It's just as appreciated when you come and stop by. If you haven't subscribed, please do. Just do it. Get a notification then. It says I'm here. And give me a like and a comment because I read them all. Try joining me for a live chat. I love them on my premieres on a Wednesday and a Sunday. So people come and my community here is amazing. And I'm not biased, it's real because I read the comments and I get involved and it's the nicest place on YouTube as far as I'm concerned. Today's case, it's not an easy one. I'm not gonna lie. Rooting through for cases that you haven't heard of. Obviously, quite a lot of people have said, can I do Ted Bundy? And there are some others that have come up. I'm not doing them just yet because they have been done to death. So the research element of that's going to be pretty challenging for me because I don't want to just do what everybody else has done. And I certainly don't want to do a Wikipedia, a Murderpedia précis. It drives me mad. What I want to do is something that's kind of really deep dive orientated. And that means that I'm going to have to spend some real time just addressing the area and maybe not doing a linear exploration of what happened. So I'm digging for cases that you probably don't know about, and also where case law brings it in because of the fact that I think that's quite an interesting area as well. And today's case is one of those. So the case I'm going to cover today is that of Richard Kenneth Djerf. And it's one of the most brutal, reckless, unnecessary set of murders that I think I've ever come across. And don't get me wrong, every murder is completely, relentlessly unnecessary. But when you hear about the motive for this, it's mind-blowing. It's absolutely mind-blowing. Now, I know that people commit murders for a whole range of reasons. In the case of Richard Djerf, it's simply revenge. And that would see a whole family destroyed in the most gratuitous of fashions. And I know this is really judgmental, but you all know me. I'm not one to shy away from judgment. I think sometimes judgment is an appropriate and acceptable thing. And in this case, I do. And you know me on this channel, I'm always saying, you can't spot somebody who's a murderer, you can't spot somebody who's a rapist, you can't spot somebody who's a paedophile. And that is absolutely true, aside from occasionally. Because in this case, you take one look at this guy and you think, there's something that's not quite right about him. Yeah, Richard Djerf is the individual who somehow manages to fit that stereotype. So who was Richard Djerf? Well, first of all, he's born on the 6th of November 1969 in Phoenix, Arizona. I will note that his mother has talked about the fact that her pregnancy was not a simple one. And actually she had some significant issues during it. And in particularly, she had issues during childbirth. So we have to acknowledge this because we know that things like oxygen starvation, traumatic births can certainly have an impact on the child's brain. The baby's brain is very malleable. That's why they're born with the patella still soft because of the fact that it's still growing. So to some degree, any traumatic injury that occurs during labour is clearly going to have a potential impact in the future with that child. Also, she looked back and said that actually he did also have some pretty bad falls on his head as a toddler. Now, on one level, I'm thinking, does she mean he just like banged into a wall? On another, did somebody literally drop him on his head? Because that's a serious issue if that's the case, because the developing brain can really be impacted by these kind of injuries. That said, a lot of children do have bad falls and do bang their head and are perfectly well. But nonetheless, we can acknowledge that his mother, from an external looking in to him and his development, can see that there might have been some issues. He didn't have the best childhood. It wasn't idyllic, but it wasn't an abusive one. So even though it was imperfect, there wasn't anything that stands out and makes us say, okay, this was highly traumatic. This is an individual, when being formed and forged, has problems, and therefore we can expect there to be ramifications for those. But there were some concerns to some degree about the way the parents were around him, because it seems that neither of them were very doting. They weren't very attentional based. And actually he describes later on in his years as his father being really cold and aloof. And when we look at offenders, very often we will look into the background of their parenting and we'll see that a particular individual parent will have been either very, very aggressive or almost so distant that the child is left grappling for some kind of attention. And arguably that's a painful position for any child to be in. Children want to feel safe, warm, loved, secure. They don't want to believe that their parent doesn't necessarily value them. And of course, that's not to say that aloof parents don't value their child, but on a personality context and exchange relationally, it's going to be a struggle because children don't have the consciousness to understand what is going on with that parent in their lives that makes them so distant from them. They internalize it. What is it about me that makes me not lovable to this individual? And there are so many stereotypes about parents from TV onwards where we're given this blueprint theory about what a perfect parent should be. So kids do have a measure early on. It's a rudimentary, it's unsophisticated, but it's powerful. His parents also divorced when he was 6. So again, we have a level of trauma there. It's a painful experience. And Djerf did spend time living with each parent in the years that followed. So we can add to that inconsistency, because even though it's excellent for children to live with a father and a mother when they've broken up separately because you want to have that engagement, it can create some chaos if there isn't a great deal of structure or the relationships aren't powerfully connected. And his mum says, looking back, one of the things that kind of stood out to her was that he rarely interacted with his friends. So he was a relative loner. He was an individual who didn't necessarily find it that simple to connect with people. And that tells us something about his nature, because when you think about offenders, there are particular offenders, particularly disorganized offenders, and I'm going to immediately put this guy in a disorganized offending category because I know what he does. We expect to see sociopathic offenders on the fringes of society. So not very charismatic, not necessarily that clever, not very engaging, and certainly struggle with relationships, both on a friendship level and even in personal, intimate relationships as well. Now, Djerf's father says that he noticed that his son was becoming more of a loner when he started high school. Again, that isn't the biggest red flag, is it? I mean, certainly I found it very difficult to fit in at high school. And I think a lot of us feel quite alienated and isolated. Being a teenager is bloody hard, it really is. And at the end of the day, to some degree, if you don't have those kind of abilities to just engage and be in with that group, often you can find yourself on the fringe. But nonetheless, if we add it to all the other ingredients that we're seeing, it does seem like Djerf struggled to have kind of positive relationships. And he ultimately dropped out of school. I have to say he did in the end obtain his diploma, but it says that he's not necessarily fitting the cogency of the system that he's within. By the time he's 23, he's still living in Phoenix, so he hasn't necessarily spread his wings, shall we say. And at this point, he's working as a night security at the local Safeway supermarket. So at this point, he meets 21-year-old Albert Luna Jr., and the two become friends. And like you would imagine, when you have friendships, you start inviting your mates round, and Djerf did invite Luna to his apartment. And Luna and Djerf were actually friends until 1993. However, this is where it all starts to slide. Because in January 1993, Djerf is absolutely incensed when his apartment's broken into and several items are stolen. And the things that are stolen include an AK-47 assault rifle. I know, is it just me? Seems like a very aggressive thing to have in your home. Who do you think's coming for you? An AK-47 assault rifle in your house? I know, like in America you're allowed guns, but I'm pretty sure that's a really serious piece of ammo. A television had gone, Video player had gone, stereo equipment had gone, and a car alarm had gone. And Djerf was absolutely convinced Luna was responsible. The reason for this, to be fair, is that Djerf knows that Luna has been arrested for burglary and theft. That was in 1992. And it turns out at the point when he'd been done for this burglary, it had been a relatively large amount of things that he'd stolen. He'd stolen approximately $8,000 worth of alcohol, cigarettes, cash, and that was when he was working as a caretaker at a local supermarket, which is not good grace when you're employed to do a certain job and then you end up stealing the things from the place that you're being paid. And at the point when he'd been found out, he'd been fined, he'd been given 4 years probation. But then there'd been another occasion and he'd been caught breaking into a salon, and at this point he'd been sentenced to 4 months in prison. So Luna has form. And Djerf, to some of us might put 2 and 2 together and make 6. But certainly, as far as Djerf's concerned, he's let this guy into his apartment. He's meant to be friends with him. He's got this history, and immediately he thinks, I know that Luna's done this. And he's really angry. And he goes and does the right thing. Djerf goes to the local police force, Glendale Police, and tells them about it. And he gets more and more frustrated after doing this because as far as he is concerned, the police are doing nothing about this investigation. And I will be honest with you, I think a lot of us feel that way. Certainly the way that policing has gone, certainly in the last couple of decades, it's become very much about putting priorities in order. So if there isn't somebody in your home threatening you, then you're not necessarily on a priority list. But the fact that your house has been burgled, you've been violated as far as you're concerned, you've had things stolen, you think you know who's done it, it is going to be frustrating if the police don't seem to be acting on it. You're not thinking in a way that says, oh, there's been a rape and a murder and there's a home invasion with an actual individual in the house. The police are going to take that more seriously because they have to. They're not necessarily avoiding doing the work, they're just prioritizing what they consider more worrying work that they have to attend to. But if you're the victim of a burglary, it's gonna stress you out. It really is. Violations of the home make people feel psychologically very disturbed, but certainly Djerf becomes rageful. And actually that rage grows. It grows over 2 months because the police are not investigating, and he gets more and more frustrated. You know, his anger is growing because as far as he's concerned, the police are not investigating, the perpetrator's getting away with it. Justice isn't being served. And that, to some degree, is a horrific twist of fate. Because in the end, he just thinks, right, if the police aren't gonna deal with this, I'm gonna deal with it. And you and I might think to ourselves, okay, fair enough, you know, he wants to go around, maybe have a bit of an altercation, try to find out whether this guy has actually taken it. Who knows, even rough him up a little bit to try to get a confession. These are all things that would not be acceptable. It's vigilante behavior, but we get it. There's nothing like feeling like somebody's violated you and they've got away with it. But that isn't the way that he thinks about this. In fact, what he decides to do when he takes matters into his own hands is just unimaginable. And it really is unimaginable. The story I'm going to tell you is just beyond reason, beyond reality. It challenges the very essence of what makes us human. And when you think about individuals like Djerf, it sends shivers down your spine, because these are individuals who, to all intents and purposes, might have been a bit odd, might have seen a little bit fringe in our society, but certainly didn't stand out in a way that would in any way give a vision of what was to come. Richard Djerf decides that he is going to get justice, and he's going to do it in the most violent and disgusting way possible. So now we know that Richard Djerf is absolutely incensed and intending to bestow his own justice on Albert Luna Jr. Now, Albert Luna Jr. lives in Phoenix with his parents, Patricia and Albert Sr. He also has 2 younger siblings, that's Rochelle and Damien. 18-year-old Rochelle, who was she? Well, she was a senior at Trevor Brown High School. She also worked a night shift at the local grocery store to help with the family's finances, so she was really responsible. You know, she was a girl who was trying to do her best by her family. And her principal at school would later reflect on her personality and say, you know what, she was this popular, gregarious, friendly, kind girl. People had really good things to say about her. And she had a little brother, Damien, typical 5-year-old boy. He was known as a really happy, pleasant child, friendly, you know, a kid just enjoying the miracles of childhood, surrounded by a loving family. Their parents, Patricia and Albert, had married shortly after high school, so they were living that all-American relationship where they'd met young, got married, created a family, and both came from copper mining families. And the reason that they'd arrived in Phoenix was, like most people, they'd gone to seek work. They'd gone to better themselves. Albert worked as a lab technician for an engineering firm, and Patricia was a part-time caretaker at Byron Berry School. Now, their lives were just continuing as normal. We know that they'd obviously had their ups and downs with Luna Jr. He'd been in trouble with the police. That's not easy. But the rest of the family was functional. The rest of the family were just going about their business, getting on with their lives. Late morning, 14th of September, 1993, Djerf goes to the Luna family household, and he is armed. He is terrifyingly armed. He's carrying with him a 9mm Beretta handgun. He's got a knife. He's brought latex gloves with him. He's even got handcuffs, and he's got some red fuse cord. Now, this is interesting because as an offender, which you will hear about later on, he's quite disorganised in many ways. The way that he kills, for example, is disorganised. But this is organised. He's one of those classic organised, disorganised offenders. He kind of crosses both boundaries. So the fact that he turns up with all this stuff, he's planned it. He's articulated that he's going to do this crime. He's thought it out. He's prepared. And to some degree, that shows great organisation. But later on, we'll be able to show you the disorganised traits within this. But terrifying. He's got a kill kit. Think about Ted Bundy. Think about Dennis Rader. These are our classic organised offenders, and they come with their kits. So to some degree, Djerf at this point has articulated that this is a crime he's prepared to carry out. He's thought it out. He even takes some fake flowers. He wants to pose as a delivery man, you know, and that's a good ruse. You see somebody at the door with a pile of flowers, you're not going to be thinking, this guy's going to murder me. You're thinking, oh, somebody sent me a nice treat. So he's even thought about the psychology of that. And clearly, he's got one thing on his mind at this moment in time. He's armed, he's prepared, and he wants to kill. The door's answered by Luna's 40-year-old mother, Patricia. And it's at this point she must have been absolutely horrified because Djerf gets his gun out, forces his way into the home, and Patricia's there with a 5-year-old son, Damien. The confusion that she would have been feeling, the protectiveness that she would have felt over a 5-year-old child, the terror. You know, there is nothing more terrifying than an individual turning up to your home, invading your privacy, aggressing you in a space that's meant to be safe. He takes Patricia to the bedroom, he ties her up. Now, initially, he leaves her 5-year-old son, Damien, untied. And then, for whatever reason, he decides that he's going to untie Patricia. Then he sets her to work, essentially. He says, right, go and get some items for me. I need to steal some stuff. Now, he's got Damien at this point, is holding him hostage. So she, of course, at this point is probably thinking, oh my God, thank God. He just comes to steal. This is fine. I'll give him whatever he needs. So she goes and gets 2 video players, a telephone, a caller ID box, a stereo CD player. She gets 4 watches. She also manages to find a money clip with food stamps. And he says, go and put them in the back of your family car. So she does that. She's probably thinking, my God, he's going to take the car and leave. That's going to be your hope, because we always live with that hope, don't we? We've got this internal ability to make the best out of some of the worst situations. And I imagine she's just thinking, my God, you can take everything. I'll help you get the couch out. Because this is her hoping that this is a home invasion, that she's going to be able to soon have this over and cuddle her son and make sure that they can get back to a semblance of normality. That's how you would feel. But that doesn't happen. He then takes Patricia and Damien into the kitchen. He then binds their legs and arms, he gags them, and then he ties them to the kitchen chairs with rope and electrical tape. Anybody who's ever put tape over their mouth or nose, you will know that if you restrict one area of the airway, it's really panic-inducing. I know that you can still breathe, but to some degree, particularly if the mouth is covered, it feels very restrictive, and that can cause intense panic in victims. So I imagine that both Damien and his mother were absolutely struggling at this point, and they would have been terrified, utterly terrified. This is when Djerf introduces the fact that he wants to know where Luna is, because this is why he's gone round. So he says, you know, where is your son? And ironically, it turns out he's out of the house. He's not going to be home till way later. So the reality is that the very guy that he wants retribution over isn't even going to be home. How ironic. And does this deter Djerf? Absolutely not. Not at all. He has come with one motion of mind, and he is going to action that motion. I find what he did to Patricia next beyond evil. Beyond evil, because he basically starts asking Patricia, who do you want to die first? You or Damien? Imagine being that mother. Knowing that this man is firstly armed, that you're tied up, you're now defenseless. And now he's posing that question, who do you want to die first? What a question to ask anyone. Imagine being an individual has to make that decision. Do you want to see your child die, or would you rather they see you die so that you don't have to go through that horror? And he kept that torment going for hours. Several hours. To put that in context, several hours. All the way until Patricia's 18-year-old daughter, Rochelle, arrives home at 3 p.m. Now, she walks in and Djerf actually isn't expecting her at this moment in time, because obviously it's not as if Patricia's going to be giving any information about her daughter. She'd be protective of her. She's probably hoping to God that her daughter goes somewhere else, but she doesn't. And she walks in that home, and Djerf then totally turns his attention to her. He takes Rochelle, who's obviously panicking and terrified and has no idea what is happening, to her bedroom. He ties her wrist to the bed. He gags her, uses tape and tissue paper again. That is horrifying. To have your airway compromised that way is panic-inducing beyond belief. He then uses a knife, he cuts off her clothing, and then he rapes her. She's 18. This man, this stranger in her home, violently raping her that way. But that isn't where it ends. Because after he's put her through all of that, and her mother's downstairs listening to this, he stabs her multiple times and he slits her throat. And Rochelle suffered some really serious injuries. She had 4 stab wounds to her chest, and her jugular vein was severed. And the actual autopsy that came back said that 2 of those stab wounds were so severe, they would have been fatal. So Djerf didn't even need to cut her throat. He'd done enough previous to that. And it's almost as if there was this real relish that he had about inflicting that pain and torture upon Rochelle. And I've got to say, that girl fought. She's 18. This man's armed. And she fought hard. And when the coroner looked at her injuries, she put up a really big fight. You know, her earring was torn through her earlobe. She had marks on her wrists, which indicated that she'd been fighting against the restraints. How physically and psychologically traumatic must have that been? And the other thing that they discovered is that at some point she'd actually vomited and inhaled it because of that improvised gag around her mouth. And that would have made it even more horrific. The fact that she had traces of vomit in her lungs demonstrates that she would have been really struggling to breathe. And it's also worth noting that after she had been killed, it looks like he stabbed her in the right temple. Like overkill beyond belief. And we use overkill, don't we, to express and explain those blitz killings. And that was a blitz killing. And all this is happening whilst Rochelle's mother's still restrained with Damien in the kitchen. What would be going through her mind? Imagine hearing your child screaming and then silence, because there's no way you wouldn't know what had happened. And that's exactly what she was going through in those final hours. She didn't have to wait long, though, from when that silence arrived, because Djerf came down from Rochelle's bedroom and bragged. He told Patricia he'd not only raped her daughter, he'd murdered her. At that point, I imagine Patricia knew that she was going to die. I mean, I imagine there'd have been fleeting moments where she thought to herself that maybe this is the end. But once she knew that her daughter had been horribly murdered that way, she would have known. It was just a matter of time, right? About 4 p.m, so after all this has taken place, Albert Sr. arrives home from work. It is hard to envisage, conceptualise, even imagine for a second what Albert Luna Sr. would walk into. Just imagine that sight. Your wife is restrained, your child is restrained. They're obviously terrified. And Djerf's there, armed, and he threatens him with a gun straight away, handcuffs him, makes him crawl on his hands and knees into his bedroom. Think about that for a moment. What are you trying to do to your victim when you make them crawl on your hands and knees like an animal? It's about power, isn't it? It's about humiliation. It's about, how can I demean you? How can I show that ultimately I have power over you? How do I have dominion? This is your home, your family. And look, I'm making you crawl on your hands and your knees. It's power play beyond belief. And it's humiliating. This is the father of this household. This is the man who pays the bills with his wife. This is an individual who has looked after his family, provided for his family. And now, like an animal, he's crawling to his death, essentially. Djerf was enjoying it. He was enjoying the psychological, emotional and physical distress that he was causing. The more mental anguish, the better it was for him. Now, what are we talking about here? Clearly, we're looking at psychopathic personality disorder, aren't we? Arguably, we could say sociopathic, because this guy is not the kind of guy that you're going to invite to a party, is he? No, this is a guy that can't really fit into what we would expect socially. So, like I say, sociopathic, psychopathic personality disorder, because he's more fringe. He's not the kind of guy that you want around. He's not the kind of guy you'd invite on a family picnic. So he gets Luna Sr. and he handcuffs him to the bed. He makes him lie face down. Again, what does that tell you? Makes him lie face down. So there's almost like a dehumanization, isn't there? There's a disassociation. But also it positions him exactly how he requires, because he wants to smash his skull in. And note how he's using different items to dish this out. So again, the way he's killing transitions. He doesn't have a particular MO aside from to kill. And he takes an aluminium baseball bat to smash Luna Sr.'s head in. Horrifying. Albert sustains 3 really large lacerations to his head, and when the police came and when the investigators came to look, the room was just absolutely splattered with blood. Djerf at this point thinks that Albert's dead, and because of that he takes the handcuffs off his body, because obviously he's thinking about using them elsewhere. But to be on the safe side, he tapes his hands and wrists together, and then he returns back to the kitchen. Now, Patricia's already been told that her daughter's been murdered, and now he relishes in telling her, you know, your husband's dead now. And her nightmare isn't over. And you just ask yourself, don't you, what was it about him that made him keep Patricia and her son alive? You know, he'd happily gone and raped and murdered one person, then smashed the skull in of another. What was he doing it for? And it has to be because he wanted to watch her fear. He wanted to see her terror. Because ultimately, that is the level of control. It's a God level, isn't it? A mother with her innocent 5-year-old child, totally defenseless, without any power, and he knows it. And it's like bleeding the pain as much as possible, holding that power for as long as possible, witnessing that terror in ways that I think none of us can imagine, and enjoying it. And that is next level psychopathy, isn't it? It's next level. Djerf at this point decides that he's going to turn his attention to 5-year-old Damien, and trigger warning, this is child death. And I struggle to know what happened, and I struggle to hold in my brain what this child went through. Bear in mind, we have had the psychological trauma that he has had for hours. Damien's already been through the absolute unimaginable, but the physical anguish that Djerf's going to subject him to even exceeds this. So Djerf's already taken massive pleasure in tormenting Patricia and Damien, and also we know that he's taken great pleasure in torturing and killing Rochelle. Evidently though, he takes even more pleasure inflicting pain on a defenseless child. And again, it's almost like this is his pièce de résistance. This is what he's been waiting for. He's got Patricia as a witness. He knows exactly where she'll be. A mother and a child's bond. You know, when it's a loving parent with a child, the bond is inextricable between them. It is literally connected. And if a child is harmed in front of a parent, the parent feels that pain. The parent would replace themselves in that position. They'll do anything to stop their child being in agony. So imagine Patricia having to watch what happens to her child in front of her. Because it seems like Djerf decides that the way he's going to kill this child, this 5-year-old child, is to experiment with a different range of ways. So initially he decides that he's going to try to break Damien's neck, like he'd seen in the films, is what he says. He wanted to break his neck like he'd seen in the films. So he stands behind the child and he tries to twist the child's head around to snap his neck, but it doesn't work. And basically he manages to twist the head of the child pretty much all the way around. And it still doesn't break. A lot of you will know that children are more malleable with their bones. You know, they heal quicker, they don't break as often. You know, children are very much growing, so there is still this malleability about them. He then attempts to electrocute him to death. He strips back an electrical flex on the kitchen lamp, tapes bare wires to the skin on Damien's leg. That doesn't work either. Imagine what Damien's going through at this moment in time. Imagine the pain, the shock, the fear, the looking at Mummy and thinking, why aren't you stopping this? And she must know that. She must know that's what the child's thinking. He was probably screaming for her, crying for her. He's also been told his sister and father are dead. And now he knows that this guy, whoever he is trying to kill him in many different ways. However, in spite of this all going on and this child going through this, there is an unexpected turn of events. And it turns out that Albert Sr., who's had his head caved in essentially, is still alive. And not only is he still alive, he's regained consciousness, he's managed to remove his bindings from his wrists. And yeah, I mean, he is critically injured. He's critically injured. But he manages to get his hands on a pocket knife. And I think that Luna Sr. knew that he was going to die. And I think the only thing that he cared about was trying to save his family. Because he knows this guy is armed. He knows Djerf has got many, many arms. So he probably knows that there's no way he's going to be walking away from this altercation. But he just wants to protect his child, protect his wife. He staggers downstairs with his pocket knife, charges at Djerf in the kitchen. And they struggle. Bear in mind how seriously injured Albert Sr. is, and yet he manages to stab Djerf lots of times. I mean, he seriously injures him. However, Djerf has got the upper hand, of course he has, and he attacks Albert with a knife, and he stabs him, wow, with such force. It goes straight through his right arm, into his torso, and pins his arm to his body. And Djerf simply takes his gun from his belt and shoots Albert 6 times, killing him. You'll be unsurprised to know that the autopsy would later reveal that the initial assault with the baseball bat was probably likely to be fatal because he had severe hemorrhaging from the lacerations. But it also shows you something, doesn't it, about love? That you can be mortally wounded and literally taking your last breaths to some degree. But if your baby's in pain, if your baby's in trouble, if your wife's in pain, if your wife's in trouble, then you're going to take every last ounce of your life energy and you are going to fight. And I think that wherever they are now in the big, beautiful beyond together, it will be testament to a relationship full of love that he would have sacrificed himself willingly and knowingly to protect the people that he loved. Now add to this Patricia and Damien. Think about what Damien's been through. And now they've witnessed Albert Sr.'s brutal murder. His lifeless body fallen at the feet. Simple as that. And if that could not be any more catastrophic for these individuals who've borne witness to all of this carnage, their family being massacred, Djerf then asked Patricia, do you want to watch your kid die? Or do you want your kid to watch you die? And then he shot both Patricia and Damien at close range in the head, killing them both. I mean, part of me for Damien thinks, my God, would that have been merciful relief? Because that kid must have been absolutely in agony. What happened to him was just harrowing, horrific, tragic beyond belief. Patricia and Damien spent 7 hours being terrorised by him. 7 hours. And during that period of time, he brutally murdered 4 members of the same family. He'd never even met any of the victims. They hadn't harmed him in any way. Like, these were complete innocents. They had done nothing wrong at all. They were just living their life. Now, Djerf, when questioned about this later, said, something took over me. I'm not saying I got possessed. I just lost control. Everything was like speeded up. It wasn't drugs. It was just me. Like Chris Watts, isn't it? In fact, most serial killers as well. They kind of talk about this being taken over, this darkness, this possession. But actually it's like, no, it's just you. It's just a part of you is unbelievably dark, negative, evil energy even. That's what it is. We all have the capacity to be negative. We all have the capacity within our minds to think about those things. Many of us go through moments of fantasizing about what we'd like to do to somebody who's harmed us. Of course we do. But the difference is we have those thoughts, we do not act on them. We feel like we wish retribution to occur, but we do not create it because our conscience kicks in. Conscience. Think about it. How many of us could ever even think about inflicting real harm on another human being? It's like so tiny, the amount of people who can do that. But he didn't just do that. He did that to children, young people, 18 and 5. And these individuals were completely innocent of any of the problems that he'd had with Luna Jr. Now, Djerf needs to cover his tracks, right, at this point, because he knows that there are a pile of bodies and he recognises that there is a strong possibility at this moment in time that forensically he's screwed. Because one of the things about his organisation is it didn't include a lot of organisation forensically, including the fact that he's bled everywhere. So this is a perfect place for a forensic to go in and be like, bang, 2 rights, got him. So he wants to burn things down. Now, again, a lot of stereotypes associated with burning things. If things get really, 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 really hot, then okay, things will get destroyed. But for the most part, it has to be like a really high temperature for forensics to properly be decayed. But nonetheless, he's watched too much CSI. So he decides that he's going to pour petrol all over the bodies, on the kitchen floor, through the rest of the home, because he wants to make sure that he has a fighting chance at getting away with this. He doesn't ignite it immediately because children were playing outside. No, before you think, oh, so there was some conscience there. No, there was no conscience there. He wasn't bothered about the kids playing outside. Probably if he could have got the kids involved with getting burnt too so they couldn't witness him, he would have done it. But it's just the fact that they're outside, they will see him. He doesn't want them to be able to ID him. So he thinks, right, I'm gonna have to be a bit ingenious here. So he turns on the gas oven hobs, leaves a cardboard pizza box and rags burning on them, and then expects that the house will blow up. I suppose that's a pretty linear thing to believe. There is a level of sophistication there. At least he's trying to do something that will mean that the house is destroyed, but it doesn't work out. Divine intervention doesn't work out because God's like, you are going down. Sorry, might not believe in God, but if you do, he says, you are going down. So it doesn't essentially set fire. It doesn't set a light. And that means that the whole crime scene is preserved. Oh yes, Djerf. Not that clever really, are you? Not that sophisticated. Lot of forensics there. So Djerf leaves the family home. Obviously he's in the car, and then he returns to his apartment where at 6 p.m. he meets his girlfriend Emily Boswell. Emily Boswell is like, why have you got injuries all over you? This is very strange. And he basically says, look, I got into an altercation, 2 guys tried to mug me. So he then goes to hospital and he gets admitted for treatment because he's got some serious stab wounds. The bodies of the Luna family don't get discovered until later on that night. Why? Because Albert Luna Jr. has been trying to contact his family all day, hasn't got any success, obviously doesn't think anything tragic's befallen them. He gets home about 11:45 p.m. He's been working his night shift at a Walmart store. And then he enters his house. All he sees is carnage. Bodies of his parents and his 5-year-old brother. His father's lying on the kitchen floor in a pool of blood. His mother and his little brother are tied to the kitchen chairs, the bloodied, slumped over. And in a nearby bedroom, the body of his teenage sister still tied to the blood-stained bed. Luna would later state that he walked out of the house backwards, just calling the names. I mean, it's just such a human reaction, isn't it? It's just a visceral, cerebral connection with those individuals. It's like, what? Just how do you ultimately go from these individuals that you saw in the morning, alive and well, a little kid running around the home playing, a sister going to school, parents chattering? How do you go from that to these bodies? It's such a leap to take, isn't it? So it's unsurprising that he leaves that house just like muttering the names, shouting the names, hoping it's a nightmare. How often do we do that? How often do we get in situations where all we hope is it's just a nightmare? I know I've been in them. His immediate reaction is to drive to his girlfriend's house and to call the police. And I understand that. I mean, you're not going to want to ring the police in the house, are you? It's too terrifying to see that. The police and fire services get there really fast. And they have to evacuate several of the homes surrounding the house because obviously the gas leak's now been there for hours and it's a danger zone. Now, simultaneously to this, Djerf, Mr. I think I'm a prepared killer, even though he's tried to make it so that he's going to get away with it, it seems there is a big problem, aside from the fact that the forensics are all there and they're definitely going to be able to put him in that position, in that place, and fit him for it, because he's been really useless at the sophistication where forensics is concerned. But aside from that, the biggest problem is Djerf's mouth. Cannot contain his excitement about wiping out this innocent family. Now, his ego is far bigger than his need for freedom, and he just needs to brag. So on the 15th of September, he basically tells his girlfriend Boswell in detail how he'd murdered 4 members of the Luna family. He even goes into details, like he says, about the blood dripping from Patricia's gunshot wound and how it was really awesome and you should have been there. Yeah, that sounds like an amazing date. Like, totally normal. I mean, I've always thought maybe like a romantic picnic or the cinema would be a place that preferably I'd go, but yeah, like a family murder, that sounds like the perfect like 11th date. This is where psychopaths and normal, well-adjusted humans show such distinct values. Because to a psychopath with no conscience and no empathy, all they're dealing with is what they felt. Hey, it was great, I really enjoyed that. And they cannot perceive a life or a position which is different to their own. So they can talk to you as if you would completely get that. Can you imagine what she would have thought in that moment? You should really have been there. Oh yeah, well, I'm not a psychopathic murdering bastard, so I'm thinking maybe you're a little bit off, and we definitely need to discuss potential Christmas presents in the future because I'm imagining we're not on the same page. On the 16th of September, Djerf gets discharged from hospital because obviously he's been in getting his stab wounds treated, and at this point his friend Travis Webb picks him up. And after he's been picked up, Djerf basically says, look, I don't want to go back to my own apartment. So Webb decides that he's going to check him into a motel. And yet again, Richard, we shall say loose lips Djerf, again discloses what he's done to the Luna family. So he's admitting it to multiple people. Djerf actually stays in that motel until the 18th of September. Is it just me who thinks, what were his girlfriend and friend doing, not speaking immediately to the police and going, I've got a psychopathic maniac person that I know in my life, you need to come and pick them up right now. This is where the motel is. Drives me insane when people don't do that straight away. During the time at the motel, you know, he's thinking to himself, oh my God, I've confessed to 2 individuals that I've murdered this innocent family. No, he didn't do that. No, not at all. He gets in touch with another mate, Daniel Greenwood, and like, I've murdered the entire family. This guy cannot shut up. What does that say about him? Glee. Proud. He's glad that he's done what he's done. He's not going through any remorse. He's cold-blooded beyond belief. As far as he's concerned, he is justified in his actions and he enjoyed his actions. And it's almost like when you think about an individual like this, it was always going to happen with someone, wasn't it? Because this isn't because he just wanted to get retribution on Luna Jr. It's not. That's not it. He's just been looking for an excuse. He's been looking for a perfect opportunity to justify in his head what he believes others deserve, to allow himself to carry out these sick fantasies. So the investigation begins. Now, originally, the Luna's neighbours believed that the killings might have been gang-related because apparently in the past, the Lunas have been targeted by vandalism. And apparently, Albert Jr. was also being pressured into joining a local gang. So there is some belief that maybe there is some beef between a gang group and the family. Also, his car window has been shot out on one occasion. But fortunately, because of the fact that Djerf can't keep his mouth shut, all these multiple admissions have occurred, the police in Phoenix start finding out what really happened. So they get a warrant. They search Djerf's apartment, motel room and car. And during this search, it's pretty instant that they find loads of incriminating items. So they find handcuffs, a 9mm Beretta handgun, stereo CD player, 2 video recorders, there's some artificial flowers in a vase, watches. He's got Rochelle's charm necklace, he's got Patricia's car keys, he's got a telephone with him, food stamps, red fuse cord that we know was used in the killings, and also a cardboard knife sheath. Bang, 2 rights. So they arrest him pretty much shortly after that. Now, at the time of the arrest, police also found him in possession of a handcuff key and a newspaper clipping about the murders. What do we see in our serial killers? What do we see in people with really, really high levels of psychopathy when they've carried out murders? Yet they like to follow what's happening. They enjoy it. They like feeling that they're outsmarting the police. They like having these kind of little mementos of their impact, and that's what he's doing. So now police have got items both used in the commissions of the murder and taken from the Luna's family home. So it's a very strong case, and they are building an incredibly strong case against him. At this point, you're also probably wondering about Albert Luna Jr. You know, he's the only surviving member of the Luna family. His absence on the fateful day are basically the reason that he's alive. But his absence on that day is also the reason that his parents and siblings are dead. Now, we have to be honest. It later transpires that he was responsible for burgling Djerf's apartment. So Djerf wasn't wrong. Those suspicions that he had about Luna Jr. were right. But you can't justify what Djerf did. At the end of the day, he slaughtered and executed a completely innocent family because of some items that were nicked. He could have waited for the police investigation to have been carried out. He could have even got into an altercation with Luna Jr. That would have been not justified, but I suppose more understandable. So, like I said, when it comes down to the motive for this crime, was it really revenge? I think it was just a perfect excuse to kill. Now, if the police had investigated, would Luna have been arrested and would his family have been saved? You know, that's another question. Or would it just simply have been clarification for Djerf that he had a right to carry out these violent fantasies? Oh, well, now the police have arrested this guy. It confirms what I believe. Right now, I'm going to seek retribution with his family. The trial. So what happens? Well, Djerf's charged with 18 offences in total. Now, 4 counts of first-degree murder, first-degree burglary. There were 4 counts of kidnapping, sexual assault, 4 counts of aggravated assault, attempted arson of an occupied structure, theft and misconduct involving weapons. Like, the evidence against him was just, wow, overwhelming beyond belief. Now, the weapons that he'd used in the murder had also been found at his home, along with possessions that he'd stolen from the Luna family home. Like I said earlier on, there was also a large amount of crime scene forensic evidence. You know, his sexual assault on Rochelle, blood from the stab wounds that had been inflicted by Albert Sr. in his heroic attempt to save his wife and child. And these are all very clearly hugely incriminating factors. It's going to be really difficult for anyone to argue anything in his defense. During the trial, one of the things that comes across acutely is that Djerf has got extremely narcissistic tendencies, and these are highlighted very effectively. Now, when you actually think about what are narcissistic tendencies, well, massive arrogance, superiority, ego so big it couldn't fit in this room or house. These are all things that we expect to see. So you won't be surprised that during the trial, because he thinks he's so clever, he just goes like, I'm going to dismiss my counsel. Just going to dismiss my counsel because I know better. This is a counsel who at this point have been working with him on the case for 18 months. Like, narcissism on steroids. Simple as that. So the 15th of February 1995, he actually applies to the court to represent himself, so to exercise his constitutional right, basically. Now, his counsel are like, this is not a good idea, Djerf. This is not a good idea. Do you know why? Because you're a bit stupid. Like, you have a massive ego, but you're not bright. You're not bright. Let the professionals deal with it. And Djerf's like, I am so bright that I am able to know that I am brighter than you. Just because you are massively qualified, just because you are a barrister, and just because you've got a whole team of lawyers, and that you spent your entire career working this field, why do you think you're better than me? Like, I'm a security guard at Safeway. You know, at the end of the day, I'm definitely in the right place. I'm in the security field. I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that security guards are not capable of being very bright. I'm just saying they're not well trained in legal ramifications of representing the self. But nonetheless, even though he's not legally trained, even though he's only got a high school diploma, even though he can be facing the death penalty, he's like, this is a gig I need. And obviously his counsel warned him, just don't do this. And even the judge is like, this is a ridiculous idea. Hello, I'm a judge. I may be putting you to death, but even I think this is stupid and I want you to be found guilty. But Djerf is adamant. He's like, I have watched CSI. I can definitely get away with this. I've even studied Ted Bundy, and he did it for a while, and I think he was good. You know, that's probably where his mindset is. The narcissism is just beyond belief. And he says, the reason that I'm going to defend myself is because, like, basically the evidence against me is so freaking strong that what have I got to lose? Like, your life. I'm just going to throw it in there, Djerf. Your life, possibly. But anyway, that's what he believes. So 23rd of February, the court rules that Djerf had voluntarily, knowingly, and intelligently, can we put that in inverted commas? Can somebody put that in inverted commas? Intelligently applied to represent himself. Can we change that to the court ruled that Djerf had voluntarily, knowingly, and stupidly applied to represent himself? That would be more appropriate. I don't think they can do that, though. I don't think that would have passed the actual bar for him being allowed to do it himself. Permission was granted. Simple as that. What can you do? If somebody won't be represented, if somebody has been told why they should be represented and they throw it out, what can you do? Now, his counsel at this point are basically demoted to providing assistive duties. Can you imagine what that's like? You actually have to assist this guy who's just like thrown you out and sacked you. I can imagine they were all like very helpful at that point. So Djerf will be like, what do I need to know? And they'll be like, I don't know. We're really not bright enough to represent you, so do you want a sandwich? That would be my attitude in that situation. Or even, oh, right, well, I think it's really best if you say that you definitely did it and you really enjoyed it. That's my advice. You know, because to some degree, you'd want to play with that person. Is it just me? This is why I'm not a barrister. And be like, that's not acceptable. You disbarred. Be like, well, you think it's not acceptable. My conscience said it was very acceptable. Now, there's an old adage in law. The person who represents themselves has a fool for a client. I like that. The person who represents themselves has a fool for a client. And he did. Djerf was certainly no exception to that rule. This is why some of those cliches are very, very good. So his competency to represent himself was pretty much challenged immediately because he tries to kill himself in custody shortly after his arrest. But we're not going to feel sorry for himself about that suicide attempt, because he was either trying to escape a sentence or he was trying to make it look that he was mentally unstable. But in spite of this, a medical expert did actually say, no, you're competent, you can represent yourself in spite of the fact that you've done this. So contrary at this point to advice that is received from an earlier counsel, because he's been told don't go into a plea agreement, he just goes into a plea agreement. So at this point, he's just going ahead and just doing what he thinks is right, even though everybody else around him is saying, this is not the best idea. So when he goes into this plea, it's agreed that in return for a guilty plea to first-degree murder, all the other charges against him would be dropped. That's not a plea deal. It's just not. It's not a plea deal because of the fact that you're admitting to 4 counts of first-degree murder. The others were all lesser than that. So he's agreed that he carried out the most aggressive, hostile and barbaric acts and let all the others go. But we have to acknowledge that in his mind, he's not very bright. He's thinking, how do I get myself into a position of power where I don't necessarily get the death penalty, for example? And he isn't doing this to spare the friends and family of the Luna family. You know, he's doing this for himself. He didn't want to face a jury of his peers. He didn't want to be judged by a group of individuals who would clearly say this guy has carried out a heinous offence and deserves to go down forever or die. But I do think he was hoping that by giving that guilty plea, that he would have avoided the death penalty. But the plea stipulated that if he agreed it, there'd be no limits placed on the sentencing powers available to the court. This is why you need representation from qualified individuals. Because that wasn't a plea really, was it? It was just a, yeah, I'm guilty. Now that meant, because there were no limits, the death penalty's on the table. And it won't surprise you to know that about 2 months after he'd agreed this plea, Djerf was like, I don't know whether that was a good idea. You know all that advice I was given by those incredibly well-trained professionals who've studied long and hard for many years. I wonder now whether I should have just accepted their points of view. So he reappoints the defence counsel for the sentencing stage. It's comedic if this didn't involve the family slaughter of all these innocent human beings. And I'm glad that he made that plea deal. I really am. Because he thought he was like so much more intellectual than everybody else. And of course, he's sealed his own fate, hasn't he? Now, as always, when the court actually have to consider what's happened, they have to look at aggravating and mitigating factors before passing the sentence. So let's look at those seriously aggravating factors. So first of all, the murders that were committed for pecuniary gain. The murders were carried out in an especially heinous, cruel and depraved manner. One of the victims, Damien Luna, was under the age of 15 years of age, so he was a child. And the court actually did say that these were massively aggravating factors in this crime. And the court could not be persuaded that there were any mitigating factors at all. The court actually appointed a medical expert, and that medical expert conducted lots of extensive neurological testing on Djerf, you know, to give him a fair trial, to see whether there was anything extenuating regarding his mental or physical health that could have corroborated that there was a reason why there was mitigation. But actually what it concluded was that when the tests came through, he was in line with antisocial personality disorder. He wasn't delusional, so he didn't have delusional disorder. He didn't have schizophrenia. Yes, they did think that he had some learning disabilities. Another reason why not to sack your counsel, Djerf, but there was no evidence of a severe mental defect. So he didn't have anything that was serious enough that would have given him some mitigation. And that showed that he definitely knew what he was doing. He knew it was wrong. He wasn't insane. It was as simple as that. So now we have a guy who might have had some developmental issues mentally, but actually on a psychological mental health issue, he was completely sane. And it was a correct analysis. It really was. When you look at the way he acted and also subsequently the way that he acts, it's without doubt he knew exactly what he was doing and why he did it. In fact, Djerf would later tell reporters, I'm not crazy. I don't hear voices. I didn't have a terrible childhood. I just did what I did. Djerf is therefore sentenced to death. I don't know why I'm smiling. It's terrible. Sorry. There's just a bit of me. I think it's the bit where he went off and just decided that he had a better idea of how to make a plea deal. That's what I'm smiling about. It's not the fact that he's going to be sentenced to death and die. It's just the fact that It was always obvious that was going to happen because he accepted a plea deal with no limits and went for killing 4 innocent people, one of which was a child. So it's just the superiority. Whenever I hear a psychopath's superiority and ego bring them to a position where they're actually going to die, it kind of puts me in line with universal chaos. And it's like, you created chaos, balance has occurred. You killed, you'll be killed. So he's sentenced for those 4 murder charges on the 22nd of May, 1996. And the judge, you know what I'm like, guys, you know I like a good judge summing up. And the judge who passed that sentence said that Djerf had relished the time he spent killing the Luna family to get revenge against his friend. And he was right, he did. And he also said, look, I've looked at the mitigating factors, which don't exist, but the aggravating factors were so serious. There's only one option, and that is the death penalty. Apparently, at this point, Djerf scoffed at the multiple death sentences because obviously he was given 4 death sentences and he's like, they can only kill me once. And I'm like, yeah, they can, but I'm reckoning hell won't be fun. Just saying, Djerf. Now, he appealed his conviction because all killers with a conscience seem to do that, don't they? Sorry, but it's just one of those things. I just think, like, when you bang to rights that way and you've got those sentences and it's clear you've done something really heinous, just gracefully accept it. But he appeals to the Supreme Court of Arizona and he's basically like, I had ineffectual counsel at the original trial. No, you didn't. They said, don't sack us. Court found it to be untrue. His counsel had worked really hard. In fact, the counsel had interviewed over 50 witnesses and kept in regular contact with Djerf. And Djerf also argued, I should not have been allowed to represent myself. And we're all like, you're right. You're absolutely right. The problem was you were the one who wanted to, and you were the one who sacked your counsel, and you were the one who refused to take advice from your counsel and the judge. Anyway, the court were like, mate, know your place. That's not true. You were competent. Now, he also claimed that Damien's, Rochelle's and Albert's murders weren't especially cruel, heinous or depraved. Now, I will say that as far as Djerf is concerned, maybe they weren't. Maybe he could have thought about some even more terribly brutal ways of killing people, but to the average, normal, well-adjusted human, you can't really think of anything worse than what happened to that poor family. So the appeal court were like, let's have a think about that. Albert's murder. Well, he was conscious during part or all of the initial beating with the baseball bat. He then had to struggle with Djerf in the kitchen whilst in great pain. He was stabbed so fiercely the knife blade pierced his right forearm, perpetrated the torso where it was later found embedded. Let's look at Damien's murder. He tried unsuccessfully to break the poor boy's neck. He tried to electrocute him. He was present when Djerf told his mother he killed Rochelle. He witnessed the murder of his father. He was held hostage for several hours and he didn't know at this point what was going to happen to him. Rochelle's murder, well, she'd been bound, suggesting she was conscious when she was repeatedly stabbed. Otherwise, there'd have been no need to bind a dead, unconscious person. She suffered psychological anguish due to the uncertainty of her fate. She was taken into her bedroom, she was gagged, she was bound. She had contusions and abrasions all over her wrists, which means that she was trying to struggle against the restraint, so she was clearly traumatized. She suffered unspeakable anguish during the attack. She had her clothes stripped from her body. She had an earring torn from an ear. She'd vomited behind the gag, an aspirated vomit. She was raped. She had a throat slit. She had 9 stab wounds inflicted upon her. I mean, come on. Come on. He doesn't think they're heinous crimes. They don't think they're brutal. What is with his conscience or lack of it? Now, ultimately, you won't be surprised to know that the appeal court found that all 4 murders were especially cruel, heinous, and depraved. Djerf also tried to argue that the killings weren't for pecuniary gain, but for revenge. Like, again, not sure that's an argument. Well, I did kill them, but I didn't kill them for that reason. Doesn't do a lot to ingratiate himself to the possibilities of him not being the monster that he is. So the appeal court are like, we've considered this and no, dismissed. And the fact that he'd made Patricia load the car with all the family possessions, which he'd then taken from the scene, it shows that he definitely intended to financially benefit. He dumped the car and then he actually took the Luna's possessions, so he was definitely going to do something with them. Finally, Djerf argued that his genuine remorse hadn't been taken in the trial. But that's because there wasn't any. Just going to put that before I go into it. Wasn't any. Anyway, the appeal court said, not true. We don't believe you at all. Because during the trial, he basically blamed various people for the murders. That included his girlfriend, like I said, that she learned a few things about him. The police, yeah, they're certainly the kind of people who go around murdering families. And Albert Luna Jr., who had a tight alibi. He was at work, but why not just throw anybody into the mix? This shows he wasn't remorseful at all, because you would say, I definitely did it. Now, Djerf would later state, of course I regret it. I wish I'd taken somebody with me that day, and I wish they'd taught me out of it. Yes, I bet the Luna family do too. But is this regret, or is this actually self-pity? Of course it's self-pity. He doesn't want the consequences of his actions, that's it. And do you know what? He also told the authorities that under other circumstances, he'd kill again. Ultimately, the court upheld his conviction and sentence. In 2019, so really recently, he further appealed it, but the US Supreme Court were like, don't even want to hear it. Didn't even want to hear it. Not even interested. I do love it when justice is served really appropriately. Is it just me? Do I sound gleeful? It's just what he did was so reprehensible, he deserves whatever he gets. So Djerf is currently on death row in Florence, Arizona. He's been there 25 years, which is weird because of the fact that 25 years is a long time. In the UK, you'd be out most of the time. Now, strictly speaking, we would consider him a mass murderer, even though you would say, well, he's got all the MOs and all of the signatures to some degree of an individual who's a serial killer, because he did it on one event, so he's considered a mass murderer, not a serial killer. So a mass murderer is somebody who kills 4 or more people at one time, whereas a serial killer, you have to kill 2 people or more on separate occasions with a cooling off period. So he's a mass murderer. But personally, I think that Djerf is probably responsible for many other unsolved violent crimes. I mean, I think we can all agree that this kind of killing is usually something that somebody builds up to, right? I mean, think about it. This is a quadruple homicide. It involves rape, torture, and the killing of a child. Also organised to some degree, massively disorganised when it came to the actual slaughter, but certainly elements of somebody who was prepared and planned. That speaks to me about possible previous offences, possibly many of them. You know, either way, we can all agree, can't we? Massively warped mind. You know, he evidently relished violence. He enjoyed the psychological torture that he put his victims through. He was somebody who really was able to own that space. He would have watched every single one of his victims terrorised, tortured, terrified, literally feeling like their world was ending, and he enjoyed that God complex, that choosing when, where and how he was going to put those people to death. That's what makes him especially dangerous. Now, when, if ever, Djerf gets executed by lethal injection, we don't know, because 25 years is a long time to be on death row and there hasn't actually been any action, and I'm sure that that frustrates the hell out of the family members who are left, because obviously they want their justice. The warrant of execution was issued by Arizona Supreme Court in February 2002. The US District Court issued a stay of execution 1 month later. So Djerf is one of 20 Arizona death row inmates who has exhausted all of his appeals. So, you know, he's had his moment to try to get off, and none of them have worked. Earlier this year, Arizona Department of Corrections stated it was ready to resume executions for the first time in nearly 7 years. So death row, he really is a dead man walking. You know, whatever his fate will be, and let's be honest, it's likely he's going to get executed, without a doubt, I would say. It's just a matter of time. At least we know that he is in the right place. He's never going to be able to harm innocent people again. And one would imagine there is a special place in hell reserved for him. I can imagine a few of the people who'll be neighbours, but nonetheless, I imagine that he's in for a very hard time in the afterlife. You know what my feelings are. I think you pay for the things that you do in this life, so you better be careful the way that you act. And I would also say that one of the things that will be very clear is that he won't have been given an easy time in prison. You know, the nature of his offences were so serious, they involved the torture and death of women and children, that therefore he will be noted as the worst of the worst by fellow inmates. And nobody wants to be in that position. in jail. It's as simple as that. I hope that you found this interesting. It's just unbelievable to me that human beings exist and can carry out these kind of horrific murders. You know, I think you can see when people are rageful or crimes of passions, and you can see the way that they interact in those circumstances and situations, and they show the very worst of themselves and they carry out heinous crimes. But man, when it comes down to this one, you know, we're talking about a group of unrelated, innocent family members. They had nothing to do with the initial slur as far as he was concerned on his life when his items were stolen. We also have to remember that Luna Jr. has to live the rest of his life knowing that his actions caused that kind of reaction. He obviously wasn't guilty of that offence, you know, as far as he was concerned. All he did was steal a few things from a mate. He didn't think that that was going to embroil him in the murder of his very beloved family. And I imagine the guilt and conscience level that he has to carry is just almost unbearable, if not unbearable. And he did not deserve that, nor did his family, no matter what outside people looking in think. Yes, there was a chain of causation. He did something and it caused ramifications that were grotesque, but no way did he deserve them. If you like this video, then why don't you subscribe and get your notifications on so that every time I release content, which it is a Wednesday and a Sunday religiously, you will be able to be notified that I have released my content. Again, for all of you returning and my lovely cyber family, Kenny's Crime Cult, thanks for being here. See you again soon.